What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated armies from the last week of competitive events and break them down. This is for the weekend of August 10th through 11th, 2024. However, we will talk about some events from earlier in the week because this weekend was the World Team Championships, the WTC, an enormous multinational team event for the game, which included both a single War Masters event as well as the team event proper. And while I don't usually cover team events in this series, I will be doing some coverage on the final results for the WTC later on this week, so stay tuned for that. But today we will be talking about that War Master GT, and that was a huge super major level event, over 400 players. And to be honest, it kind of drew a lot of the talent, I would say, from other events around the world. We saw a couple smaller events also take place over here in the United States. There were a couple of larger GT level events, but most of the other GTs this weekend were smaller sized. But we'll get into all of that momentarily. As always, big thanks to everybody who supports the channel. You can help support the channel over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise or by joining YouTube memberships. I appreciate everyone who does that, as well as everyone who supports me over on Twitch as well, where I do live stream all my 40k games, as well as do some live commentary of games. So please check me out. You can find a link in my link tree down in the video description. And let's dive into a metagame breakdown. Eldar are finally back. It's real. The Eldar resurgence has come. Their return was prophesied in the ancient writings. We may be back to the dominance of the Eldar faction in the 40k metagame, with 4 undefeated results this weekend, not only at the Iowa Open, but also at the Grand Onslaught 8 and Arch City GT, where they almost swept the event, taking the first and second top placement. Thousand Suns also had a pretty solid result. They were able to secure a top 4 placing, which was post-cut. They cut to the top 4 at the end of that event for undefeated players. Thousand Suns were able to make that and also go undefeated at the Grand Onslaught 8. While not all of the players in that top cut are going to be undefeated, I will talk about all of those lists, at least inside this metagame breakdown from the War Master GT. Each of those lists had all wins going into that top cut, so they were close enough. Blood Angels also did well at the Salt City GT, as well as taking 4th place at the WTC War Masters. And that War Master event was won by an insane Black Templars list that we are for sure going to be talking about. Space Marines also kind of resurgent today, although to be fair, it is largely non-compliant chapters because we also saw both Deathwatch and Dark Angels at the Tables and Towers Summer GT. That one was absolutely destroyed by Space Marine players, and we also saw Space Wolves undefeated at the Tronderdome. Chaos Space Marines took down the Cross Swords War at the Westward 5. World Eaters took down the Club Seal Cup. Necrons also had a top placement at the WTC War Master GT. And we also saw some additional results from Adepta Sororitas, not quite as dominant this week as we have seen them in the past, which is interesting to see. Only 1 win from them this week. Also no Drukhari, so that's a little interesting. Moving back to the Arch City GT, Tyranids also went undefeated. They went X-0-1, so 1 draw on their record. I don't always talk about these guys, but I do have a rampant Tyranid bias, so we are going to be discussing them today. And let's, with that, dive into some lists, starting with our Elfin Masters, the Aeldari. We're going to go over to the Iowa Open, where James Kelling took a very cool MSU style of Eldar build. This included Azerman attached to a unit of Dire Avengers, give the unit a little bit of staying power, as well as some of that repeatable Overwatch, which is very nice as an anti-infantry unit, good at defending against small units encroaching on Eldar territory. An Autarch Wayleaper alongside the Avatar of Cain. That Autarch Wayleaper was the Warlord, by the way, to generate command points. We are not taking Yvrain this time around. This is a true Craft World Eldar list, not Ynnari that we've been seeing become more popular as the season is going on. Avatar of Cain, as I mentioned, a Death Jester with Fate's Messenger to allow him to auto-6 his dice rolls, good for either his sustained hit Shrieker Cannon or the devastating wounds on the wound roll for that Shrieker Cannon. That Death Jester is a classic combination. It actually fell out of favor for a little while, but is coming back in. Now, the Fate's Messenger did get nerfed quite a while ago, 2 seasons ago at this point, but only affects the character with the enhancement, not the character's unit. Excellent on a Death Jester or an Outtalk Wayleaper. Less good elsewhere. We have a Farseer, as well as Fuegan and Karandros attaching into a Striking Scorpion unit. That Striking Scorpion unit does give the list a little bit of forward operation, so you're able to defend against enemy scouts or other forward operators. And if you go first, Karandros attached to those Striking Scorpions hits like an absolute Mack truck. The Eldar list, a pretty terrifying alpha strike. That's backed up by Falcons to deliver some of these Aspect Warriors, 2 units of 2 Sky Weavers in order to add some additional utility. Those equipped with Haywire Cannons for anti-tank, alongside 1 unit of Swooping Hawks for some scoring, 2 individual Warwalkers, both of those equipped with Bright Lances for some additional forward operation and anti-tank shooting, alongside a Guardian Defender unit to generate some additional fate dice. That moves us over to the next best performing faction this week, Thousand Suns, who went undefeated at the Grand Onslaught 8. Mike Buseni took a Thousand Suns list to the event. This one was fairly standard fare, running Ahriman on a disc alongside 2 Exalted Disc Sorcerers. Interestingly, that's where the enhancements were going in this detachment. One with Lord of Forbidden Lore to duplicate rituals, one of them with Umbralific Crystal to teleport his unit around. The Umbralific Crystal also gives you a lot more options to get the movement debuff on target with that Exalted Disc Sorcerer. It's very difficult to escape from that guy. So if aggressive units are threatening the Thousand Suns lines, he can usually teleport into a position to slow you down. An Infernal Master with Arcane Vortex, because he's great, alongside 4 units of Rubric Marines, 3 units of 5, and 1 unit of 10, with Warp Flamers likely to attach Ahriman into in order to get that big brick of auto-hitting +1 to wound flamer attacks that are very good at knocking out just about anything in the game. We had a Thousand Suns Rhino to deliver some of those Rubric Marines, alongside 3 units of Zangor Enlightened, all of those with great bows, and 2 Mutalith Vortex Beasts to round things out. Fairly standard Thousand Suns fare at this point. The inclusion of the Rhino is always interesting. That does reduce your Cabal point generation somewhat, because your units do not generate Cabal points while in the Rhino, but it allows you to survive indirect fire, so if that is an issue in your metagame, the Rhino's super important. Plus, Rhinos are pretty good just generally. 75 points for a not unresilient transport with a bunch of Inferno Combi Bolters on top of it that you can use as a utility unit is pretty good. Now with that, let's move over to Space Marines proper. These guys had an insane week with a ton of different chapters seeing success. The first one we're going to discuss is Blood Angels, who took 4th place at the WTC War Masters with another wild Space Marine list. Actually, WTC War Masters was kind of dominated by Space Marines a little bit, both Blood Angels and Black Templars in that top 4 cut, and both of them with kind of insane Horde mode style lists. This is Georgios Floros running a Sons of Sanguinius detachment, rocking a Jump Pack Captain. The Captain with Jump Pack is an interesting inclusion here. It's not actually a very common inclusion in Blood Angels Sons of Sanguinius lists. Occasionally, though, he's good at jumping into elite infantry squads that don't necessarily have the base strength value that we see Power Fists equipped with, for example. So while Death Company squads, for example, can start out at a base strength 8, and with the bonus from the Sons of Sanguinius detachment get up to strength 10, lower strength power weapon equipped squads, for example, do need that +1 strength of the charge from the Captain with Jump Pack. He also helps you out with that Rites of Battle and his own Power Fist attacks as well. So we do have a Vanguard Veteran Squad and a Sanguinary Guard in the list that could benefit from the Jump Pack Captain's attachment. We also had Lamartes for a 10-man Death Company Jump Pack unit, the Sanguinor, because he's amazing. We also have Commander Dante in the list, giving his unit +1 to hit and +1 to charge. He is also going to be attaching into one of those Sanguinary Guard squads, and he is the Warlord in this case, so he's also turning on that Sanguinary Guard's additional -1 to be wounded effect, making the unit -1 to be hit and wounded in melee, and with Armor of Contempt stacked on top of that, these guys get ludicrously difficult to kill. Plus, Commander Dante is making them hit on 2s, so you can use them to attack potentially not your Oath of Moment target, and then use the Captain's unit to target the Oath of Moment target to make both units very accurate. That's alongside a standard Intercessor squad for a little objective secured action, 3 units of with 5 Jump Pack Assault Intercessors for utility, being joined by a Scout Squad and a Vanguard Veteran Squad, alongside those 2 units of 10 Sanguinary Guard, 20 Sanguinary Guard, all of those equipped with Inferno Pistols and Carmine Blades for a ton of those 2 damage melee attacks that get up to very reasonable strength characteristics with the detachment ability. 10 Jump Pack Marines for Lamardis to jump into, alongside a Death Company Dreadnought. Bit of an interesting inclusion, but in the Prime Nexus update, Death Company Dreadnoughts were confirmed to fight in response to every melee attack targeting them unlimited times during the fight phase. So these guys can bounce around fairly effectively if they can continuously engage new enemy units that are forced to fight them, and then they get to automatically fight back. Death Company Dreadnought, pretty good as a reserve unit that can come off the side of the table and force your opponent to screen it, and as a little bit more of a resilient unit. We have a ton of these medium infantry, and while Sanguinary Guard are difficult to kill, having a high toughness vehicle with a 2+ save also helps as a bit of a bulwark for the list. This list is wild, ever-present discussion within the Blood Angels community between the Sanguinary Guard stands and the Death Company Marine enjoyers, and this list is taking both, but definitely a little feather in the cap of the people who like Sanguinary Guard in this case, because 20 of them did as well as it did at this event. So it's super cool to see this Sanguinary Guard focused army doing well. Now, speaking of super cool armies doing well, let's move over to another Space Marine chapter, Black Templars, and Weiss Olivier, who went undefeated at the WTC War Masters, taking first place at that event using a Righteous Crusaders detachment. And this is one of the wildest lists that we've seen in 10th edition so far. Weiss was running a Castellan with 10 Hausers Bones, giving his attached unit an enhanced Feel No Pain if Uphold the Honor of the Emperor is active for the army. We also had a standard chaplain as well as Chaplain Grimaldus, who can essentially duplicate that Feel No Pain or give his unit advance and charge, both good benefits from his different relics that he chooses every turn, alongside High Marshal Helbrecht, who is an enormous force multiplier for these Crusader units, and a Lieutenant with Combi Weapon as a utility unit, who can also give you some wound rerolls as well. Super useful. Backing that up are 2 Scout Squads for utility and 100 Primaris Crusaders. You heard that right, everybody. There are 5 units, no more, no less, and that is the entirety of the list. That's every single model in it. That's the whole thing. I actually have a video from way back in the day when the edition was released about how ludicrous Primaris Crusaders are, and every once in a while we see armies like this come out of the woodwork and do well. For whatever reason, Primaris Crusaders are one of the highest attack volume base infantry in the game. They have 5 chainsword attacks each, and when you combine that with critical hit effect and enhanced critical hit effects from High Marshal Helbrecht and the Righteous Crusaders detachment ability, these guys do absolutely insane damage. On top of that, you are scout moving with 100 infantry that potentially have some pretty solid defensive characteristics, and they're in one of those units that have the 5+ Feel No Pain, so you're trying to chew through a Feel No Pain on top of what is 40 wounds on a 4+ or 3+ save inside each of those units, and when you shoot them, you can devout push them even farther, potentially using Abhor the Witch, Destroy the Witch in specific matchups against Psyker heavy armies to give yourself some additional movement in response to enemy shooting, and each of those units represents up to 40 OC on objectives, so trying to wrest the center of the table away from these armies is ludicrously difficult. No shooting to speak of, really, but just being able to push opponents entirely off of objectives and score big points is absolutely huge for these Black Templars, and clearly it did well since they were able to go undefeated at this super major level event. The event used differential scoring, and Weiss did get a 10-10 draw in his first round, but was able to win all of his subsequent rounds with huge scores, scoring 2 20-point wins as well as an 18-point win and 2 16s, all of those pretty dominating scores in order to make that top cut, and then won all of his top cut games as well for a final record of 7-0-1 at the end of the event, better than everyone else who had attended, and an absolutely stellar showing with an insane list. Now that moves us on to another Black Armored Space Marine chapter, and this may be the very last time we talk about this sub-faction in 10th edition 40k, because they are now being entirely deleted from the game and rolled into Agents of the Imperium with the new Xenos Hunters detachment and Deathwatch kill teams in that codex. Mark Hurdle went undefeated and won the Tables and Towers Summer GT using Deathwatch and the last outing of the Black Spear Task Force. Mark was rocking a Judiciar with Thief of Secrets, a Librarian with the Beacon Angelus, and a Watchmaster with that all-powerful Tome of the Ectoclades to give his army hit and wound rerolls against 2 targets in place of his normal Oath of Moment once per game. That is the biggest buff that you can get out of the Black Sphere Task Force, and it supercharges units like Sternguard Veterans that the army also includes, so they can fire enormous numbers of devastating weapons, buff them using the special issue ammunition stratagems, and then get their devastating wounds with those wound rerolls from the Tome of the Ectoclades. We also had 25 Deathwatch Veterans, 2 units of 10, one in a combined arms unit with frag cannons and thunder hammers, one of them in a more melee-focused unit, taking long vigil melee weapons and thunder hammers, alongside another unit of 5 with 2 thunder hammers and 2 heavy bolters. We had a Rhino to deliver that melee unit alongside 3 units of assault intercessors with jump packs to act as utility, 3 Inceptor squads, 2 units of 3 with plasma exterminators to act as utility, and just a solid damage output unit. The twin-linked 3 damage weapons on those plasma exterminators are always good, especially once the Tome of the Ectoclades turn has ended and they no longer get wound rerolls on the other units baked in. We also had another Inceptor squad with assault bolters. That is a 6-man. Those guys could benefit because they have a bolt weapon from the special issue ammunition stratagems, giving them some pretty powerful weapon upgrades. Alongside that aforementioned 10 Sternguard Veterans to get those devastating wounds on the Tome of the Ectoclades turn, and a Stormspeeder's Thunderstrike to buff up those attacks as well. Pretty technical list. It's nice to see Inceptors back on the table, and we have seen lists like this start to do well as the community has kind of rallied around Deathwatch in the last couple weeks and really done some deep thought into the faction. This is definitely one of the better Deathwatch lists, despite the fact that Deathwatch have had a traditionally terrible win rate over the remainder of the edition. Some very good players like Mark are giving it their best shot and seeing some success with the faction before it is rolled into Agents of the Imperium. Now, another faction that we have been seeing some success with in the last couple weeks is Dark Angels, and the other finalist at the Tables and Towers Summer GT was Sean Reynolds, who went undefeated with the faction. This is a fairly classic Gladius Task Force build from Dark Angels. It ran an Apothecary Biologus with Fire Discipline, Azrael attached into a big unit of Inner Circle Companions, alongside a Judiciar who could jump into an Assault Intercessor squad. We had 3 units of Jump Pack Assault Intercessors for utility, as all of these lists have had so far. 3 units of Deathwing Knights, those guys equipped with Maces of Absolution to add a solid melee bulwark to the list, and their insane resilience dominating the middle of the table. Backing that up was an Eradicator squad, 6 Eradicators to attach the Apothecary Biologus with that Fire Discipline combo to trigger 5-up critical hits, sustained hits, and lethal on those Melta attacks when Devastator Doctrine is active with full rerolls targeting monsters and vehicles, giving you a basically point-and-click adventure game against enemy heavily armored vehicles. These guys could hop out, Oath of Moment, a vehicle, and then just roll a bunch of attacks, rerolling everything, and blow it up almost assured. If you don't have a strong and vulnerable save protecting you, these guys will straight up just kill you. We also had those 6 Inner Circle Companions for Azrael that I mentioned earlier, alongside a Repulsor, which is capable of transporting the Eradicator squad with the attached character to the fight, and a Scout squad, as well as a Calidus Assassin for utility. This is pretty standard. We've seen lists like this crop up in the last couple of weeks, and they constantly do well. Gladius Task Force Dark Angels are incredibly strong, and I don't think they're going anywhere. Now, last but certainly not least, we also saw Space Wolves do well at the Tronderdome GT. Leander Carlson went undefeated with a Stormlance Task Force using Space Wolves. Interestingly, this was a relatively Thunderwolf light Stormlance Task Force, significantly less cavalry units than we typically see from these styles of builds, but instead focusing more heavily on ranged attacks and a little bit more of a finesse approach. Leander was running a Combi Weapon Lieutenant alongside 2 Thunderwolf Battle Leaders. One of them had Hunter's Instincts to allow his unit to come in on the first battle round from Strategic Reserve, alongside a Wolf Lord with Fury of the Storm and an unupgraded Wolf Lord on top of that. We also had Murder Fang as a bit of a late game piece. He's very difficult to kill with a 2+ save and a Feel No Pain, and basically does all the things that we just talked about with the Death Company Dreadnought when we were talking about Blood Angels from the WTC Warmaster GT. We had a common refrain here, 3 Assault Intercessor Jump Pack units for utility and to clear out enemy units. These guys are super cheap, so it's not surprising that we're seeing a ton of them see play. 1 small Eradicator squad, just 3 Eradicators in that one to act as a little bit of an anti-vehicle additional utility piece, plus 2 Gladiator Lancers for some long-range punch, 2 Infiltrator Squads to protect the army's back line from Deep Strikers. That is important for an army that has so much forward momentum that Stormlands typically does, that it kind of leaves its deployment zone very often. Obviously, this army has a lot of ranged attacks that are going to be occupying that space, and the Infiltrators can help protect those. We also had 2 Scout Squads for utility, as well as 2 units of 3 Thunderwolf Cavalry. So those, when attached with the 2 characters, are going to be 5 models apiece. Only 10 cavalry in the Stormlands task force versus the 24 that we often see from this detachment. So Leander definitely taking it a little slower with this build, focusing more on those utility units and those ranged attacks, and that was working out for him. We also had 2 units of 5 Wolfen for some very efficient melee attack as well. Kind of an interesting evolution of the standard Stormlands task force, the Wolf Jail, as it's been called, that just tries to pin you in your deployment zone with concentric circles of Thunderwolf cavalry that are super tough to kill. This one is probably doing that, but also backing that up with a lot of ranged attacks, which I certainly appreciate. That moves us over to the Cross Swords War at the Westward GT, which was won by Jonathan Summerfield, running Chaos Space Marines. Jonathan's list was fairly unsubtle, which I kind of liked. A Renegade Raiders detachment, the powerful Chaos Space Marine detachment, giving the army a lot of speed enhancing effect, advance and charge, advance and shoot with assault weapons in the whole army, additional AP when targeting enemies on objectives, fast and lethal with Armor of Contempt as well available to them, so some survivability buffs on top of that too. This army was led by Fabius Bile, who's just hard to kill, and that's what he's got going for him, which is pretty good for 85 points. We also had a single Master of Executions with Mark of the Hound to give his unit Scout, and that was it. That was all of the characters. A lot of times we'll see some additional Chaos Lords in there, or some other Super Solar characters, but not today. Jonathan is just running the 2, alongside a Cultist Mob, 3 Chaos Rhinos, in order to deliver Chosen and Havocs to the fight, a single unit of Chaos Bikers to act as utility, a huge amount of backline shooting from 3 Predator Destructors with their turret-mounted autocannons plus 2 las cannons on the sponson mounts, 2 Havoc squads with Havoc autocannons to get delivered from those Rhinos, alongside 2 units of 10 Chosen and a unit of 10 Warp Talons. That's it. That's the list. I have a video talking all about the incredible synergy that Warp Talons have with Renegade Raiders. It has been nerfed slightly. Warp Talons do actually have to kill the target of their charge in order to return into Deep Strike, but with the +1 AP from Renegade Raiders, as well as the buffs from their Dark Pacts, they will typically be able to do that without really much trouble. And especially if you're charging into smaller units, little utility units of 5 Space Marines or so, there's almost no chance that 10 Warp Talons will not kill those smaller units and be able to return into Deep Strike, rapid ingress back onto the table, and do it again. All the while, you're being pinned into your deployment zone by the Scouting Chosen unit with that Master of Executions, granting them rerolls, plus a second Chosen unit following that up, and a ton of shooting from the Havocs, jumping out of the Chaos Rhinos alongside the Predator Destructors, being buffed by that +1 AP, and getting even additional AP bonuses when targeting enemy infantry. This army has a ton going for it. It's super aggressive and super fast, and clearly effective, since Jonathan was able to take it to a 5-0 record. That moves us over to the Club Seal Cup. Harry Mayo went undefeated with World Eaters. Sticking with the chaos theme here, Harry was taking a Berserker Warband led by Angron. We also saw Karn the Betrayer and Lord Invocatus alongside a Demon Prince with Battle Lust. That's a really interesting and fairly inexpensive enhancement that allows the Demon Prince to heroically intervene for free and duplicate the stratagem, even if you've already used it earlier in the turn. That allows you to potentially heroically intervene and hold up additional CP to fight on death or to interrupt your opponent. Incredibly important for a very aggressive melee army like World Eaters. It also lets you threaten a heroic intervention from the Master of Executions and still do one with the Demon Prince as well. So a lot of utility with that enhancement. The Demon Prince is also there to buff the Exalted 8-bound in the list. If they have an existing invulnerable save, he'll give them a 4+ invulnerable save, making those units significantly harder to kill, and he himself hits pretty hard as well. So it's not like he's dead weight on his own. As I mentioned before, we had that Master of Executions, a unit of 10 Khorne Berserkers to jump that guy into, with a Rhino in order to ferry them to the battlefield. We also had another unit of 5 Khorne Berserkers to attach Karn the Betrayer into, as well as a unit of 10 Jackals for utility. Following that up were those 2 units of Exalted 8-bound that could could be pushed forward with Scout with Lord Invocatus. And that was the whole list. A little bit of interesting synergy in there with that Battle Lust enhancement that I honestly have not seen before, I think, on any list. I don't know if I've ever seen anybody take Battle Lust ever, but it does seem super useful, especially alongside that Master of Executions threatening an additional heroic intervention. Makes the counterattack into very aggressive 8-bound units super difficult, since that Demon Prince is probably following those guys in as closely as he can. And that does seem incredibly useful, especially in a situation if you're fighting against a lot of other aggressive melee armies, things like Blood Angels or those Black Templars that we just talked about. Gives you a lot of options for messing up your opponent's charge and fight phase, which is super important. Cool to see a little bit of evolution in the World Eaters roster. They have been a faction that's been kind of static for the last couple of weeks, actually for most of the edition, to be honest. And while we've seen a little bit of differentiation from the World Eaters community in the last few weeks, a lot of times they have been kind of a mono list faction, so it's nice to see some adjustments in there. That moves us on to Necrons. We are actually going back to the WTC War Masters for the second place result. At the event, Arnaud Allo took second place with a Necron Hypercrypt Legion. This was a super destroyer heavy version of Hypercrypt that elected to take a lot of really interesting options, making for a very highly technical list, but that had a lot of pretty scary melee threats, to be honest. This included a Hexmark Destroyer with Dimensional Overseer to bring more units into hyperphasing every turn, Imhotep the Stormlord to give the list a little bit of CP generation, alongside a Locust Lord with a Risen Tyrant, as well as a Translocation Shroud Overlord and a Scorpek Lord. One of those Overlords was jumping into a unit of 10 Lich Guard, and we had a unit of 6 Scorpek Destroyers for the Scorpek Lord to hop into as well. That was backed up by a monolith, so you could use the Overlord to discount the cost, potentially, of Dimensional Corridor to allow the monolith to bring that Lich Guard unit to the fight, and then immediately charge out of that portal for a basically automatic melee threat almost anywhere on the table. You could also pay the full price to do that with the Scorpek Destroyers as well, and then do those mortal wounds with the Scorpek Lord on top of that. For utility, we had 3 individual Locust Destroyers, as well as 2 units of Deathmarks and a Flayed One unit. And last but certainly not least, we had some big bricks of Destroyers, including a unit of 2 and a unit of 3 Heavy Destroyers with Exterminators, that larger unit probably attaching the Locust Lord with the Risen Tyrants to give his unit rerolls when it comes out of hyperphasing, to then trigger further critical hits from that Locust Lord ability on those Enminic Exterminators. Now, the downside of those Enminic Exterminators is that while they are excellent at sweeping infantry, they are a low AP value, so oftentimes they get blanked by cover, and that can be circumvented in Awakened Dynasty by solar pulsing, but you don't have an option to get around it in other detachments unless you take the last inclusion in this list, which is, I think, one that I have probably never seen taken in 10th edition, so it's super cool to see them at the highest echelons of play seeing some success. A Triarch Stalker. These silly little spiders are 125 points and rock an honestly fairly mediocre Gauss Cannon array, 6 shots at strength 8 AP2 for 2 damage. However, after it shoots, if you hit an enemy unit, you can choose to strip cover from it, which then allows the Monolith and Heavy Destroyers to jump in and absolutely vaporize it. Pretty easy to get his guns on target as well using hyperphasing too, another big benefit of that detachment ability. This list is super creative. The Monolith combo alongside Lich Guard and Scorpek Destroyers is not particularly new, but it is nice to see it do well versus some of the more scoring focused lists that we've also seen Necrons be angling into more recently that are taking lots of Immortals and Cryptex and trying to use movement shenanigans to score points with them. We're less worried about that in this list, and in fact more focused on just murdering people. And it's interesting to see armies like Necrons with a lot of build variety this late after their codex has already kind of been solved. Now that moves us on to Adepta Sororitas, that we interestingly have not really seen do super well this weekend, but they did have an undefeated result at the Atomic GT. John Casey taking a Bringers of the Flame detachment to that event, including Morvenval and the Triumph of St. Catherine. Only 2 characters for this list, so relatively character light list, hopefully dodging assassination, which sisters do give up sometimes. The list included 2 Arcoflagellants, 3 Dominion squads, all of those equipped with Meltaguns, and each of them being combat squatted in an Immolator. We had 3 Castigators, one of them with a battle cannon and 2 with auto cannons, alongside a Seraphim squad with hand flamers to turn on the devastating wound synergy from the detachment. A second smaller Seraphim squad as well, alongside a Paragon Warsuit unit for Morvenval. Not sure we have too much else to talk about with this list. It's a relatively standard and straightforward Bringers of the Flame that we've been seeing doing extremely well since the release of the Adepta Sororitas Codex. Now, a little bit more unique of a build is Tyranids that I'm going to cover from Arch City GT. This is David Delisle's list, which went 4-0-1, did draw one game. The event did not use differential scoring. It was just a standard battle point scoring system. So drawing in that format is actually very, very unlikely. But winning all your other games means it is technically undefeated, even though it didn't place at the top of the event. David was rocking an invasion fleet, including 2 Neurotyrants. That's right, not just the one Neurotyrant that you're always taking in Tyranids. This one had a second Neurotyrant, and the reason for that is simple. We had a big Zoanthrope unit in the list, so a Neurotyrant could attach into the Zoanthropes to give them their +1 to hit. The downside of that is that you oftentimes want to strategic reserve that unit to get the best shots on target that you possibly can, and the Neurotyrant's -1 to battle shock checks from Shadow in the Warp ability does not apply when it is in reserve. So if you are trying to hold that unit for a good turn of shooting, you would actually have to bring it on a turn early if you wanted to then Shadow in the Warp your opponent and use the whole reason you're taking a Neurotyrant. So the second Neurotyrant means that you can attach one into the Zoanthrope unit, leave it in reserve, and have the other one on the table, giving its Neuroloids to your non-Synapse units, and then Shadow in the Warp whenever you want to. Not to mention the fact that for 105 points, Neurotyrants are not a bad unit. They're relatively tough to kill with an invulnerable save, and while they're not fast, they do have a really good flamer, so just fighting opposing utility units is just fine for these guys. They actually hold down the corners of the table extremely well against smaller units trying to come in and score secondaries. We also had Old One Eye in the list. He was attached into 2 Carnifexes, all of those equipped with shooty guns, including Death Spitters and Bioplasma. We had a Gargoyle unit for disruption, a Biovore to generate those Spore Mines, and a bunch of monsters. 2 Exocrines, 2 Maleceptors, a Tyrannofax with a Rupture Cannon for anti-tank, and some utility infantry, including 2 Lictors and 2 units of Von Ryan's Leapers, plus that big brick of Zoanthropes that I mentioned. The Von Ryan's Leapers are important because they give you a lot of infiltrators you can use to defend against opposing infiltrators that are running in to attack your army. They have fights first, so they're able to clear out light enemy units before they get to swing, and they heroically intervene for free, which is super useful. What's interesting is that we're not seeing any Neurolictors in this build, but with the focus on heavier weapons from things like those Zoanthropes and the Tyrannofax, the +1 to wound may just not be necessary for a list like this. And with that, those are all the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section which one's your favorite. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.